Hello, beautiful community. You're being talked at from different directions about the strategic meaning of the new Donroe doctrine and how Venezuela is an expression of it, and how things that might happen next will also be expressions of it. And I think that there's a very important misinterpretation that's occurring here. And the misinterpretation's sociological failure is that it's largely conservatives who are expressing support for the Donroe doctrine in some form, thinking that they're expressing support for conservative politics, whereas in fact, a conservative politics with a neocon foreign policy, let's say. Whereas in fact, what's happening is that, unbeknownst to them, they're expressing support for authoritarians dressed up in conservative clothes, who aren't conservative at all and who don't really have any kind of strategy, Donroe or Monroe or anything else. So let's talk about this in more detail. This is the sort of thing that's coming up quite frequently in my social media environment. So this is, throw this on the screen, just the latest version I've seen. Somebody's done some kind of a Substack or Medium article, which we won't look at because I want to treat the point as generic. And John Foreman, who's very, very strong on Russia, just requotes, the Western Hemisphere focus is not America retreating its corner, it's securing the base of operations. You cannot project power into the Indo-Pacific if hostile actors control the Gulf shipping lanes, your canal access or critical supply chains in your own hemisphere. The Monroe Doctrine reassertion enables the Asia strategy. It does not replace it. Quite, John says, the US hasn't ceded spheres of influence to China and Russia. So I think that this is very foolish. And the core cause of it, sociologically, is that what's happening is that people are viewing Trump as an erratic version of a normal politician who is at core a normal politician. That's still a sort of thing you're going to hear in many circles. And I've just named one, which is a kind of a conservative circle with a neocon twist, where the tendency is to say, well, Trump's naughty, he's erratic, but at core, he's classifiable as an agent whose strategic approach has a sort of a coherent relation to past strategies common in US foreign policy. That he is sort of, that you can map him onto, for better or worse, previous strategic positions in US foreign policy. And that's a kind of sanewashing that is in itself a denial of the consequences for foreign policy of democratic decline. So we're here reproducing a very elementary mistake, which is that we're not noticing the death of conservatism in our culture, because most people go on assuming that the authoritarians in conservative clothes are conservative still when they're not. Trump's not a conservative. Boris Johnson is not a conservative. These are revolutionary breakers of counter-majoritarian democratic checks and balances. And when you have politicians who engage in that, they do not have a foreign policy. At least until a coherent authoritarian regime is established in a democracy, then we can begin talking about that. But at the moment, Trump's foreign policy is a cacophony and an expression of very claustrophobically derived whims of the buffoon leader. They're a product of his personality challenges, not a product of a coherent approach, whether it be ethical or unethical, whether it be justified or unjustified. And we're not talking about that. We're talking about whether there's coherence of any kind there. So that's the sociology, but let's talk more concretely about foreign policy and foreign action. So the claim being made here is that the United States is going to refocus on local spheres of influence with a strategic coherence. That's the first claim, which is wrong. And the second claim is that in refocusing on regional sphere of influence, the United States will strengthen itself as a global empire rather than weakening it. In other words, you exercise, putting this in quote marks, your autonomy in your own sphere of influence that you have ordained for yourself. And when you strengthen yourself in that realm, you're then going to be in a much stronger position to project power everywhere else, be it against the Russians, be it against the Chinese. Now, notice how ludicrous that already sounds. Where is the Trump administration consistently projecting power against Russia? So I think that this is a kind of a reservation for people who are lost about the actual predicament of conservatism today. Let's say a bit more from a foreign policy point of view. So I've just used some funny language, and we don't have big numbers of viewers in South America. We have some. And, depending on where you are, your experience will be very different. It's not the same as my phrasing of the US extending its autonomy in the region. Because what you get, for instance, after the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, so we're going back over 100 years now, and Monroe Doctrine is now over 200 years old, is a litany of interventions, repeated interventions, in Panama, in Cuba, in Nicaragua, and so on. So if you're in South America, you're going to experience this history as a kind of a ludicrous farce of arbitrary disrespect for sovereignty in the region. Your sovereignty is sort of put on wheels, or made relative to the whims of the latest U.S. administration. Now, that's not a justification of the regimes in power in any of these countries. That's a separate conversation. But the farcical arbitrariness with which sovereignty in the region was treated by the United States in the 20th century is evident. So what would the person who makes the two claims we've outlined say about this? They would say, well, look, there is a reorientation to the regional sphere of influence, and that reorientation will strengthen the US empire globally. So on the basis of that, we could expect a coherent approach, right, which sort of applies the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine from the latest national security strategy, which says we're not going to let, very roughly, we're not going to let other major powers run anything in our sphere of influence. So the implication of that is that we're going to see strategically coherent interventions in the region that, if you like, once exhausted, will allow the United States to then secondly go on and exert more effectively than it could be for a global influence. And both of these points are not just wrong, but ludicrously wrong, even though serious people are recycling them. And the key thing here is that people are just refusing to admit what kind of historical moment they're in. And we have to have the compassion that it's difficult to do this, and that having just high IQ is not an indication that you're going to be any good at doing this, because it means overcoming a certain kind of resistance to reality. It means being intellectually and psychologically open to the possibility of being surprised by the shape of the world. And that's difficult for people. But both of these 2 points are not false. They are just ludicrous. Now, does that mean that there is nobody in the Trump administration who thinks these 2 points? No, it doesn't. There are certainly people in the US administration who plausibly think both. Arguably, Marco Rubio is a good example. But Marco Rubio is precisely a conservative / neoconservative politician who is not electable anymore. And how did he get power? He got power by siphoning himself on to an anti-conservative revolutionary authoritarian project. Thinking that from within that, in a hubristic way, thinking that from within that he'll be able to tilt that project toward the 2 steps that we've just dismissed as ludicrous. Now, the reason it's so self-serving and so unethical of Rubio, and it's very important to be clear about that, right? Don't buy the argument that Rubio would make, well, if I wasn't there, it would be even worse. If I wasn't there, then it'd be even worse for Ukraine. If I wasn't there, then we'd have even less coherence in our foreign strategy. Because essentially what Rubio has told himself, if we be cartoonish about this, is that he is going to increase the degree to which a risotto is cooked by entering a kitchen dynamic where pasta ragu sauce is being prepared. There's no way he's going to create a half ragu, half risotto dish that's going to work. At best, it's going to be a cacophony that undermines his own strategic purposes. And therefore, whatever Marco tells himself, he's unfortunately there for reasons of wanting power, for reasons of being attracted to power. He might not think that he wants that, but to that extent, what he thinks, and what he really thinks are separate things. So, the notion that Trump intervened even in Venezuela for Rubian reasons, if you like, is itself highly questionable. I talked in the last main channel video, which you should see if you still haven't, I'll put it somewhere here again, about how you've got a kind of a reservation for neocons in the Trump administration who are silenced on China, humiliated on Russia because Trump's sucking up to Putin 80% of the time. But they have a little bit of space to play, possibly on Iran and definitely on Venezuela. But even there, we've got to be careful about saying that without qualification. The qualification being that Trump acts for theatrical rather than for strategic reasons. So he is allowing a reservation for Rubio where, 8% of US foreign policy can be about things Rubio likes. And then Rubio has to sit there and, suffer the humiliation of his own strategic and political aspirations in other policy dimensions. But the point then is, what is Trump thinking when Rubio is supposedly allowed to guide U.S. foreign policy toward a certain direction in a limited sphere. Trump's got to be thinking that he himself is doing something that works for him there, and what works for Trump is theater, not strategy. What works for Trump is very often just the act of doing. And that's one of the fascistized elements of the Trump administration, that the act of doing is often self-justificatory. And as Trump engages in the act of doing, not quite for doing's sake, but for the sake of certain kinds of perceptions generated by the doing, analysts sanewash Trump by suggesting that he has, for better or worse, an equally coherent corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, as did Roosevelt in 1904 or whenever that was, and that Trump is an erratic, impulsive, rude, unpalatable version of a conventional political act. And that's an elementary misunderstanding, right? And these people are going to be at high risk of being historically embarrassed, because as authoritarian destabilization of institutions dramatizes in the United States and also in other parts of the West, these people are going to try to keep normalizing historically the actors at hand, Trump or his successors. And the risk is going to be that these commentators are going to have to watch, their houses set on fire and still keep justifying the fact that this is some version of some housekeeping strategy from the recent past, just delivered with a few more bumps and bruises and with a few more erratic elements. No, it's just a house being burned down. Lots of love and talk very soon.